It is now 4:25, and so I resume the hearing. Just before we pick up where we left off, the proposition, I think, is this, that we complete our discussion about ST7 now, and then deal with ST8 and ST9 tomorrow.
ST9. ST9 tomorrow.
Okay.
I'm told ST8 will be very fast. I was told, I'm only telling you what Mr. Johnson told me. He certainly gets the name right before he points the finger. Right, isn't it, Mr. Johnson?
We'll see where we get to. I have some questions about ST8. It may or may not be that they coincide with the points that you want to raise, Mr. Johnson. I don't know, we'll see. So, for now, at least, the proposition is that we deal with we'll complete ST7 and deal with ST8 today. See how we go with that. I personally suspect that we might need to move part of the discussion on ST8 to a later day, but I'm prepared to give it a go. But then to deal with ST9 tomorrow afternoon after we have had done with ST15. I would also suggest if we don't complete ST8 today, that we also deal with that at that point.
Well, I mean, it seems to me, looking at the timetable, that neither Wednesday nor Thursday, as currently timetabled, will take anything like all day. So there's flexibility on both of those days if we need it.
So the question is anyone that wishes to exercise their right to be heard and to participate, are you able to make those times? Or if you're not, could you shout now? Happy news. Okay, we'll do that. As I promised then, I'll look to the Council to reply to what we have heard, and then we will move on to some detailed points around the proposed main modifications before then moving on to ST8. Mr. Elvin.
On the general points, I've got nothing to add to what I said earlier. I just thought it might be useful. I gave you the SD102 Heritage Impact Appraisal Appendices references. The PDF page numbers might help. At PDF pages 56 to 70, I noticed that each of the sites in the appendices restarted the page numbering, which isn't very helpful, but it's PDFs pages 56 to 70 dealing with ST7 and where you'll see coverage of all the issues we've discussed. The second point is I gave you the reference to the Historic England representations at Reg 19. They deal with encroachment into the countryside as well as the impact on heritage setting. I'm not going to go into it any further, but just direct you back to those references I gave you earlier. I don't know whether Mr. Ridge has anything to add on traffic and Merton.
I think only really the point that relates to use of the 2040 figures in traffic forecasting, just to make the point that that's obviously a date that's beyond the horizon of the plan making that we're doing at the moment, and those figures will be subject to review as the plan is reviewed going forward if it's adopted.
I didn't understand what was being said.
Could you enlighten Mr. Ridge?
Of course. Mr. Merritt mentioned some figures for traffic growth and growth in traffic congestion for the whole road corridor, and the figures that were mentioned were different from the figures that I had in front of me. And that transpired subsequently that it was because the figures I had in front of me were for 2033, which is the end of the plan period, and the figures that Mr. Merritt had in front of him were for 2040, which is beyond the end of the plan period, and that explains why those numbers are different. And for 2040, there is obviously an opportunity that there would obviously be a series of reviews of the local plan between now and then that would be an opportunity to make a difference to those figures.
This is nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the country lanes in Merton. You are going to discharge large numbers of cars from ST7 onto Stockton Lane and onto Merton Way. Large numbers of cars. Where are they going to go? They're going to find the Hull Road jammed, and of course they'll come through Merton. And you will not engage in this. We've asked you time and time and time again. We're ignored. And that's not fair. All the emphasis is on ST7, the inhabitants of ST7. Hang the rest. And your figures were torn up by an inspector on the Sainsbury deal who pointed out you hadn't done a traffic census around us since 2003, and you still haven't.
What I would say is just to clarify that these figures are from a different model. I'm not familiar with the Sainsbury's work, but I guess that was a single planning application that was submitted by the developer. So it would have used a different set of traffic forecasts from the ones that I'm quoting now, which are produced using our traffic model.
But there are no figures for the lanes. None. And yet you're arguing whether you have 845 or 1225 houses, half of which the cars will come out onto Merton Way, a lane. You don't answer the question.
Those figures could be obtained from the traffic model if you wanted to see them. But I mean, there is also a principle. I mean, people drive on roads. There is no principle whereby people are stopped driving on roads.
You're indicating, Councillor Waters, which surprises me because I did say it was last chance saloon, but it certainly is this time.
Right.
That's before we go on to the detail about the proposed main modifications.
That's what I thought we were discussing, actually. So it was a
very almost, but haven't quite got there.
Right, okay.
So I'm hearing the council's reply to the points that I heard earlier, the sort of big picture, perhaps the most fundamental points, to be honest. So I was going to hear the council's reply to all of that, because, as you know, I give the council the last word on points as we go through the discussion, but then to focus on the detail of the proposed main modifications. Was yours a proposed main modifications point? Okay, we'll come to that in a moment then. Okay, thank you. Mr. Butler and Mr. Natkas have both been indicating for quite a while. So if I hear from those two, and I'll come to you after, Councillor Waters. If I forget, stick your nameplate up again. Mr. Butler.
So I was just going to, because I raised a while ago, because it was just in response to what the council said, so it was more of a general point, and Mr. Butler's then going to deal with the modifications. You were pointed in the direction of SD 102, which is the annex to the heritage impact appraisal. And I think what was said is that if you read that document, it will look at the western edge and look at how it was considered, and there were concerns raised, and that's why the boundary is where it is. Now, what that annex is it's the consultation with English Heritage. So it's English Heritage's view with regards to this site and their consultation response. And it's just to flag a couple of points for you for when you're reading it as invited to do, because there's quite a number of pages to it. And it's quite difficult for pages because the PDF is different. Each site gets its own numbers starting from 1 again. So whilst it starts at page 56, that's effectively page 1 for this site, if that makes sense. So the Minster's considered at section 3.2, and the potential impacts is the view that was referenced by Ms. Garcia earlier, and the mitigation is purely to look at mitigation within proposed schemes. So the Minster doesn't raise any issues with regards to that western boundary. Landscape and setting is on pages 10 to 11, which is paragraph 6.1. And in terms of the impact, it says that the mitigation, so I'll just read it out so I don't paraphrase it. The last section of paragraph 1 says that areas outside the proposed allocation towards the ring road should be designated as green belt to ensure the remaining field margin is retained. There's no reference to land to the west being in the green belt, and that's under the heading of landscape and setting, views in and out of York, and the impact again references the same viewpoint of the Minster. So it doesn't have any regard to the western edge and where that should be, and indeed it doesn't state that should be within the green belt. And just the final reference is in that same section on the next page, 6.4, the elements to consider the open countryside and green belts, and the mitigation that's included on that is to say that ensure no development further to the east of the current proposed boundaries. So again, it's purely looking at that eastern boundary in terms of the concerns that they have, where the green belt should be and where any further development should or shouldn't go. I can't find any references to the western boundary or any assessment of why that shouldn't move as was considered.
Okay, I don't know if the council wants to pick up on that before I do then move to the main modifications, but only if you wish, Mr. Owen.
I've said the points that I've said. I don't understand the position about the West. It's self-evidently open countryside. You've got English heritage, Historic England's references, and did I give you the references? I'm sure I did, to the general heritage topic paper, which deals with those matters as well. I think there's nothing going to be gained by adding further words to this debate. You've got the material, and you just have to make your mind up.
Yes, thank you for that. Okay, turning then to the detail of the proposed main modifications. Is that where you are going, Mr. Butler? Excellent.
I'm hopefully going to go there and get there quite quickly as well for everyone's benefit. Just a quick reference point. Ms. Garcia referenced page 77 of the York Central Historical Conservation Area Appraisal, which is SD 104. The reason only the exact summary we think is online, not the whole of the document. I think that's basically the difference between us. So just a checking point, really. Right. What I'll do, sir, I'll run through the table in the Statement of Common Ground as my headline points on the main mods. As I said at the start of today, a lot of the focus of the comments have been made on the need for greater flexibility to deliver all these aspirations. And I'll go through each one where I reference how they're, in my words or our view, shrinking the net developable area. I'll shout up. Point one's the key one in terms of the garden say point 1, criteria 1, it sets out the aspiration for a garden village. You've all seen in all our hearing statements for the last 8 or so years that the issue there is the net developable area and the density. So the council's approach is 70% net developable area and 35 dwellings per hectare. And effectively you get to 845 from that. But we're saying to allow space for the area to breathe from a good design point of view, the net developable area should be 60% and your density would actually be more along the lines of 32 dwellings per hectare. In my hearing statement, I provide a very simple calculation to identify what that might mean then if you kept the red line as it is, read the actual number of homes being delivered at the site, which would decrease, of course. That's what obviously would occur. So that's where the concern there comes, really, the sort of restrictive nature of the red line. And everything I'll say from now on probably leads back to that, so please keep that in mind. Housing mix, the criteria used to be removed and left for policy H3. The concern there is that when we came, or hopefully come to an application, the starting position for this settlement, being a freestanding settlement, will be slightly different to other areas of the city. The SHMA is, strategic housing market assessment, of course, is city-wide. It doesn't break down to site areas and things like that, which I know we can do via the application documents. But given what the needs and demand that these areas are going to deliver with a higher proportion of family homes, the inference or reference in the policy that lets us all know what we're needing to do at that point. And what that means, back to my first point, is that the more 4-bedroom homes we deliver, and I've referenced 35 to 40%, the density drops. So your density would drop to 30 to 32 dwellings per hectare, which effectively means you wouldn't be hitting the 845. So it's just to give that flexibility through the application process that we're not severely restricting ourselves for no reason. So that was the reason why we wanted to retain something to do with this site, to make it a site-specific criterion that the needs and demand for this area in particular. The next point is the new criteria greenbelt boundary. Not a problem with that. It gives us flexibility to define the boundaries and the detailed boundaries through the application, through detailed assessment work. The next criteria is on the local centre, and that's to appropriate facilities. So there's 2 points there, well, 3 points. First of all, no issue with the wording. The second point is the requirement for a local centre is obviously a non-residential land use, which again affects the net developable area for residential development. And then the third thing there, of course, is critical mass. And if we are delivering these facilities, which we all want to do, it's ensuring that a critical mass is there to deliver them and sustain them in the long term. Education contributions, no issue there. The next one then is highway impacts. And I'll look to Phil Owen, to my right, Mr. Owen, to see if he wants to say anything if required on these points and to pick up any earlier points. But again, the inference in the policy by referencing the other strategic sites is that we're all in the same boat and considered together, so to speak, whereas actually this site, because given its location within a few hundred metres of the urban edge, is a different kettle of fish compared to the other schemes there. And I think in terms of, I reference ST15 because obviously the requirements for ST15 are going to be far greater than this site or other sites, and it's a case of what appropriate mitigation would be required if we were thrown in the pot with them, so to speak. So again, I appreciate the wording that's been offered by the council does identify it could be discussed and looked at through detailed transport assessment work. It's just the policy infers that we would be looking at those other sites when I wouldn't want to do that at this point until the final further detailed work had been done. And that references back to the council's evidence-based work re-infrastructure requirements that doesn't link any off-site requirements to this site at this point.
I think the only other point to add to that is talked about future detailed work as part of the transport assessment and any future planning application. And that would allow for traffic growth, looking at a future build out and opening of the development. So that would allow an element of additional traffic anyway. So the requirement to specifically look at the other allocations we feel is unnecessary.
Thank you.
Yeah, my apologies, Mr. Butler. It may be that I'm just not understanding, but either way, I'm not clear what your complaint is on that point.
I'll ask Phil to, Mr. Owen, sorry, to corroborate this if I'm right. Usually when we do transport assessments, you obviously take background growth into consideration. And when it comes to committed developments and cumulative impact, it's site applications or schemes that have approval, plus then what might impact the road network from allocations within a 3-year period. So my concern is that we may be required to contribute to a mitigation associated with a larger scheme or a smaller scheme in a different part of the network. I'll think of an example would be Grimston Bar Park and Ride. So if there are requirements to expand and enlarge Grimston Bar Park and Ride on account of other developments, the policy is currently worded by reference to them may then require us to contribute to that mitigation. And it infers that by having the wording of those sites in the policy. Whereas for us, if we get the development right in the manner we're seeking to, in terms of our public pedestrian and cycle connectivity into the city and bus penetration through the site, there's very limited opportunity or limited chance that people from outside might actually use Grimston Bar in that instance. The council's amended wording does reflect that in terms of proportionality. It's just having the specific sites referenced in the policy which on the clock face of the city aren't located within proximity of the site. ST14's to the north, 8's to the north, ST15 to the south, west, etc.
Okay, I understand.
Public transport, no comment there on the modification. Happy there. Active travel links, the same. The changes to wording make things effective and provide clarification. If Mr. Owen needs to get involved in terms of... Apologies. I've skipped out my vehicular access point. Many apologies there. It's number 6, criteria 6, which is to do with, and this is probably the key point, or one of the key points of the mods really. We've discussed and sought to require that through appropriate planning there'd be a vehicular link between the northern and southern parcels of the site. So would create and allow for some penetration between Merton Link Road and Stockton Lane. And the reason for that is to aid permeability, distribution and good design and planning in effect. Because the way the policy is worded or the criteria is worded at the moment would mean that anyone living to the south of Bad Bargain Lane, needing to want to go to Monk's Cross, for example, would have to come south and around, up the 64 or through the centre of the town. So what we're seeking to do is and get the wording correct in terms of to ensure there wouldn't be any rat running through design, appropriate design and layout matters, but it's just to ensure that permeation was there if needed to actually better aid traffic distribution in this part of the city. Mr. Owen will back up a few points in more detail. When he did.
I mean, I just reiterate everything Mr. Butler has said. Firstly, my view is that there's no harm actually in providing the link. I don't think there's any specific constraint on the local highway network where existing traffic flows would necessitate to divert through the site and no obvious journey time savings. Notwithstanding that, as Mr. Butler has said, it can obviously, any concern can be designed out by the alignment nature of the spine road and making that a convoluted route between Merton Way and Stockton Lane. Secondly, I think there are actually advantages in having the connection through the site. Again, Mr. Butler has touched on them, improved permeability, connectivity for the residents of the development. And actually that's a beneficial effect on the local highway network because, you know, if you're in the southern part of the site and you want to exit to Stockton Lane, then if there wasn't the connection, you'd be going around existing local roads, whereas the through route would offer a direct connection from within the site. And thirdly, I suppose the other thing I just add, I think that the through route chimes with national guidance and local policy, you know, in particular Manual for Streets, for example, which obviously advocates connectivity, permeability into adjacent development and streets.
Mr. Butler.
Okay. Thank you, sir. In terms of the amendments to proposed criteria 7, we've got no concerns with that. That's been amended in accordance with discussions we've had. The same is can be said for criteria.
Okay, good. Move on.
Thank you. All right, I'll focus on the changes then. 9, open space. The only issue there is the definition of the 50 metres. It's an exact figure that's not been defined by detailed assessment. We're not saying it shouldn't be 50 metres, but what's it, 48, 49, 51, 52, so it would be defined through the application process. So the requirement is just to remove the 50 metre reference to provide flexibility at the application stage. Yeah, got seeing in the next one. Next one, sorry, I was waiting. The next one is to do with the candidate site of importance for nature conservation. We understand the council have undertaken any survey work recently or ever read the site, and our view is that it doesn't hold any value due to previous infrastructure works. So rather than remove the criterion altogether, we just wanted to include the should further survey work confirm the site's value at the start of the criterion to enable that work to take place. And then the final point is we requested whether additional criterion or further text associated with the policy, just to outline what can happen, the green and blue infrastructure that could take place outside of the red line. Discussions with the council, and they do point out, and rightly so, that the uses we're referring to, such as suds ponds, attenuation ponds and recreation facilities and biodiversity net gain enhancement areas can take place in the green belt. We would just be concerned or conscious then that when an application came forward, the red lines might not align with the allocation boundary, which thus might concern residents and other third parties. So the request for the additional wording is to give clarity for everyone when the site comes forward of why that's taking place in those areas. And that links back to the point of that also gives us as developers and confirms that we'll be able to get the allocation number within the red line. Because there's obviously a number of non-residential development points that need to be delivered inside the red line, and we acknowledge that, but there are elements that can go outside it, and thus it gives us flexibility to deliver the numbers in the plan. Thank you.
As quickly as I can. A number of the objections really relate to matters which will be dealt with at the development management stage. Housing mix, the implications of garden village, the criterion itself is appropriate given the concerns about setting and compactness. The issue about highways assessment, self-evident, it's a matter of a highways assessment. So far as cumulative impacts are concerned, they would have to be assessed anyway. And if there is concern that contributions are being sought for something which have nothing to do with the site, then Reg 122 will always protect them. So I don't think this is a matter which is worthy of being dealt with as a matter of soundness. It's a development management issue. So far as vehicular access is concerned, the point that's being made is inconsistent with the agreement with criterion 9. The protection of the setting of Millennium Way is protected by proposed new designation of open space. It's shown on the proposal's map. to allow an access to run through that would be at odds with that particular criterion. And again, if there are overwhelming reasons for considering a through route despite that, that's a matter for development management in my submission. So far as, where are we? Yes, so far as the SINC is concerned, well, we've said it's a candidate site. If there's nothing to support it, then there'll be no basis for seeking compensation. Again, it's flagging up issues which will need to be considered at an application. If there isn't anything to support it, then clearly compensation couldn't be sought by the council. But it's right to flag it up. I've said this in the context of other sites, of course. And then finally, with regard to the additional suggestion, with regard to out of allocation matters, such as SUDs, biodiversity gain and the like. Of course, that's again a matter for master planning and application. If the green belt boundary is adopted as we suggest, I'm channeling Inspector Griffiths here. Of course, engineering works, which they would be, which preserve openness, are not inappropriate development. Most of what is suggested here would appear to be appropriate development in the green belt, particularly if they don't impact on openness. The fact that the development that comes forward is not precisely in accordance with the allocation would be nothing unusual in the development world, and it doesn't require an alteration to the criteria. That's a simple matter, again, of development management, we would suggest. I think that deals with the issues.
Mr. Butler, you're indicating.
Just quickly, before Mr. Natkus probably wants to obviously say something, it's more a fact of I appreciate all that, but in due course, it won't be many people in this room reading those policies when we get to the application stage, and they are fairly black and white at the moment, will rather than maybe should. So it might be an opportunity post today to look at the more refined areas of the detail of the wording to see if we can come to some sort of agreement there rather than the black and white nature of it. And that's, I said that across quite a few of the criterion, I would argue.
I'm sorry, Mr. Butler, were you suggesting having a discussion with the council about a potential change to the statements of common ground?
It might end up being, sir, that these discussions will obviously move forward to make modifications in due course, which will be consulted upon, and we obviously have an opportunity to comment on them there. I'm just conscious that a lot of the wording, for example, going back to the permeability point between the two parts of the site, it specifically says will. Let me just find it, apologies. The text on here. Will be limited. Access between Stockton Lane and Merton Way will be limited to walking and cycling, whereas we think through design and layout matters that maybe should be, or if necessary. Just to give the ability to have the discussion further once, for example, the transport assessment is submitted. Because if you read that at the moment, it's black and white, whether we submit a transport assessment or not. That's what the criterion says. So I understand the point being made, and yes, we welcome the flexibility of the application stage. It's just a case of, is there specific other minor changes that might help us both in that respect?
Can I just ask, is this footpath a right-of-way that I can freely walk down?
It is indeed, yes. And it is the protection of that and its setting, which is why the council has been as specific as it has in limiting that access that would in effect run across it and through it. It wants to retain that as much as possible, but recognises that there does rightly need to be permeability across two sides of the site, but not with a busy through route in effect. Just
so I'm clear, across the historic footpath, are you saying no cars or not many cars?
We're saying limited to only public transport. Walking and cycling, yes, indeed.
Because of the impact of motorised vehicles across the historic pathway.
And its associated impact on its setting and that open space which the policy seeks to preserve, and gives weight to that particular asset.
So in the council's view, is allowing public transport, buses, across the path an element of flexibility?
It is, and also helps to incentivise and promote the use of public transport, if that is indeed a more efficient way to get from A to B.
Is it a compromise? I'm just trying to work out the difference between some cars going across the historic path and some buses going across the historic path. The impacts would be similar, wouldn't they? But I think what you're saying is you don't really want those impacts at all. But as it is, the policy is flexible and allows that compromise for buses. Is that the council's position?
It is indeed. It's the balance of judgments between what is large or could be seen as conflicting objectives. So the objective of trying to preserve and retain that setting along that path, and wanting to ensure that there is sufficient connectivity between the two parts of the site, and suitable opportunity to bring forward the bus routes. We would say that the allowing a bus route through there, the frequency of that, whilst we anticipate it being a high frequency bus route, would not be as frequent as a number of vehicles using the route.
Yes, I think that there is also a question about what that bus link would actually look like. So it could be, instead of being a wide blacktop surfaced two-way road, it could be only of width for a single direction. It could be the sort of guided busway or something like that. So in effect, a bus running with grass between the tyre.
A narrow grasscrete
yes.
route with only electric buses on it, for example.
Yes, quite possibly, and we've got one of the largest proportions of electric buses in York anyway, and we would look to roll that out.
I think you might have mentioned that before.
Very proud of it.
Mr. Butler, is you finishing off a point before I move on to others?
Just quickly before the others, the appearance can be resolved via the application process. I get that, whether it's wide enough for a bus or wide enough for a car with a footpath. It's a 2D visual issue, and that's part of going back to the links into the 50-metre discussion what the width of that viewpoint and open space looks like as well. So it's more coming back to what Mr. Owen was saying a minute about the highways and transportation, distribution and permeability benefits, that having that as a ability to take traffic, and as we've said, we agree that the design of that can be used to ensure that there be no rat running, etc. It's just to give that permeability.
Yeah, I'd just like to emphasise that connectivity point from a vehicular traffic impact point of view. Effectively, what the council is suggesting is you restrict one half of the site to one access, and the other half of the site to the other access, and that's not the way it works. If you're living in the southern part of the site, then your commute may require you to travel northwards and vice versa. And as I say, the benefits of actually having that through route for vehicles means that traffic then doesn't have to spill back out onto the existing highway network and route around the site because it can't get through it. For me, for no good reason, from a vehicular point of view, the council are permitting it as a bus route. A bus clearly has a greater sort of visual environmental effect than a car. Yes, there will be more cars, clearly, than even a high-frequency route, but they're not going to be a substantial number of vehicles along there. And actually, again, and I don't have a specific reference, but Manual for Streets does advise that pedestrian cycle routes do benefit from being overlooked and actually having some motorised use alongside them from a safety security point of view. So I know there are other issues, non-highways issues at play here, but just from a vehicular and traffic point of view, I strongly advocate.
Yeah, I mean, it's exclusively non-vehicular issues that are at play here, isn't it, that's brought this entire thing about. I mean, I haven't noticed that the council's proposed splitting any other sites for vehicular reasons, and that's not what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing is a question of balance. Do you think that's right? I need to consider both things, don't I?
Yes, absolutely, sir. In my view, yes, the connectivity point for the site does outweigh the other issues, and there should be a connection through the site. I don't see it as being harmful. The flows will not be particularly high. So yes, I do think it outweighs it.
Mr. Natkus.
Thanks, sir. I think, look, the council have got a legitimate point on heritage, but equally Mr. Owens has got a very legitimate point on highways, and as you've just said, is it for you to balance? But I think that's almost an unfair position to put you in, because there isn't the evidence for you to balance.
I'm used to it, Mr. Natkus. It's all part of the job.
There's nothing in any of the heritage documents that talk about this issue. It's just been raised pretty much today by the council in response to you that it is a heritage issue. But at the moment, and again, because I'll agree with everyone at the moment, Mr. Elvin again said it's for development management, and yes, I think it is. But if you explicitly put in the policy that you can't have vehicles, then it doesn't become for development management to balance those two competing interests. It becomes a Section 38(6) issue, and we then have to demonstrate material considerations. So I honestly don't know the answer whether you should be allowed to or not, because I think you need to see all of the heritage.
Well, thanks for your assistance in that respect, Mr. Natkus.
But I think this is the point, that you need to see a planning application with the heritage work done and the highways work done that considers all of that. And the amendment that we're putting forward enables that to happen. And it may well be through a planning application the heritage element comes out on top. But at the moment, the policy explicitly prevents that discussion taking place because it's saying there is only one solution. So I think it is a matter of soundness, because actually the test of soundness is that it should be evidenced, and I believe there is insufficient evidence before you to make that decision. Therefore, the modification we propose would still enable the discussion to go forward and see where it gets to.
Councillor Waters and then Mr. Merritt.
Thank you, sir. All this discussion of crossing over that public right-of-way with buses and possibly other traffic, it just put me in mind of the square peg getting hammered into the round hole again. But the question I was going to ask some time ago was when this transport thing first started, and it was in particular with this paragraph 6, and where we had public transport crossed off for the sentence to now say with a small proportion of traffic potentially served off Bad Bargain Lane. Can anybody give any indication of what that small proportion is, either as a percentage or in numbers? Mr. Owen said a few minutes ago that there was no constraint on existing highways. Well, I don't know whether anybody really knows the area, but Bad Bargain Lane discharges all the traffic onto Tanghall Lane. Tanghall Lane was at full capacity according to the City York Council, or York City Council as it was at the time, in 1985. And before anybody says, well, the Outer Ring Road was built after that, in that report it quite clearly stated that the Outer Ring Road would only likely take HGV traffic off Tanghall Lane. We go forward a few years, 2006, at the Derwentthorpe public inquiry, and the council said that Tanghall Lane was almost at capacity, 2006. Tanghall Lane, like Hull Road, is chaos. So I just want to know what proportion of traffic you're intending to bring off Bad Bargain Lane. Whether anybody can tell me, numbers or percentage.
Okay, Mr. Merritt.
Just a couple of short points. One, in terms of paragraph 5, obviously would like to see that all the sites are kept in the policy. It's not a new type of approach. The council used that previously when it was faced with an extensive series of developments in the Foss Islands area and then up to Monk's Cross. I can't remember the exact name of the study that was done, but because of the fact that the traffic network in York is so congested, the impacts of developments ripple out quite far in terms of junctions that are already struggling. So it is quite legitimate to look to developments collectively, particularly when there's a whole set identified that are going to be coming in a particular area, for them all to contribute towards the solutions for the general problem. I mean, if you talk about the park and ride site, as was mentioned, clearly if you expand that and get more people coming into the city to divert into it, it releases road capacity that will accommodate some of the additional journeys from all of the development sites. So I think it's a quite important principle that's highlighted here and should be retained. I'd also share, I was going to ask a similar question about the change to 6. I don't understand why there is that deletion. I think that will just, as I said, attract more traffic in terms of that particular route, which was one of the reasons why it was restricted in the first place. And finally, in terms of para 9 and the 50-metre strip, I've walked, I think, pretty much most of the walking routes out of this city. This is one of the most attractive. It's quite secluded. It's really one of the more special ones. So actually trying to retain that and its environment, I think, is quite vital. I'm saying that personally.
Okay, I'm looking to adjourn for the day in 10 minutes. So I'm going to give the council the opportunity of its final reply on these points. But before I do that, is there anything else that anyone really has to say? Otherwise, they'll feel bad about themselves when they get home. Mr. Waddington, I wouldn't want that to happen to you.
I was deeply depressed by this conversation after the last half an hour about the vehicle going across, able to or not able to. I don't see how you can really make any decision about this until you have a proper traffic census and try and work out what is best for both ST7 and the surrounding villages. Somebody mentioned the fact that if you have the bar across in the centre, people would have to come down in order to get to Monk's Cross, come down to Merton Way and then go via the bypass. That's absolutely crackers. It's an enormous distance. What you do is you turn left and come through Merton. If we're really at that level of discussion, I'm deeply depressed. I think we just need some numbers to make decisions about how vehicles are going to be using ST7.
Thank you, Mr. Wellington. Okay, very good. I'll let the council make any final reply that Mr. Elvin wishes to make, and then I will adjourn for the day. So, yeah, that leaves us with the, well, I thought predictable, but nonetheless unhappy news that we're not going to deal with ST8 and ST9 today, and we will instead pick both of those up tomorrow, even if some think we might only be 20 minutes on ST8. I doubt that very much. Mr. Elvin.
Yes, a certain degree of scepticism creeps in after a while, doesn't it? What has been said, I suggest, underlines forcibly what I've already said about these being development management issues. They do not go to soundness. The point about whether or not an acceptable means could be found to cross the public footpath and the like, those are all matters, if they were to be pursued, to be considered in development management, as indeed are the issues as to the use of the local roads, Bad Bargain Lane in particular. There will have to be a transport assessment. It will have to look at the distribution of traffic and the impact on local roads as a matter of detail, when the details of the proposal and the layouts are known. I don't think it can be assumed that creating a through route can be easily controlled so that it ought to be a given with the allocation. I understand the concerns about that. How one stops through traffic routing itself through the whole site and then out the other way, I don't know. And if you're going to put up electric gates triggered by some sort of remote, then you're adding in extra issues, all of which go back to my earlier submission that this is a development management question. That's it.
One last bite of the cherry, Mr. Waddington. Are you indicating? Okay. Okay, very good, thank you. In which case then I'm going to adjourn now until tomorrow morning. So, yeah, I make it 5:18. I adjourn the hearing to resume at 9:30 tomorrow. Thank you.